And let's prepare ourselves to hear and to receive the reading of the gospel this morning. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. This morning, if there are those of you who brought a Bible along or have a Bible near to you, if I could have 3 volunteers to read. I think a little bit more of this passage needs to be read for us this morning. So I wonder if there are 3 who would volunteer. Joni, if you could read, this is from John 10, if you could read verses 1 through 5. Joni has 1 through 5. James 7 through 11. And a third, I may need to toggle to page 2 to see the hands. Brad Wardy will read verses 12 through 16.
Are we skipping verse 6?
So Joni was verses 1 to 5. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, thank you, James. James will read 6 through 11. That's why you're the teacher and I'm not. And Brad will read verses 12 through 16. You can start when you're ready.
Ready? I tell you the truth. The man who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. The man who enters by the gate, the shepherd of his sheep. The watchman opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice.
Jesus used this figure of speech with them, but they did not understand what he was saying to them. So again, Jesus said to them, "Very truly, I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who came before me are thieves and bandits, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters by me will be saved and will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays his life down for the sheep."
A hired man will run when he sees a wolf coming and will leave the sheep, for they aren't his and he isn't their shepherd. And so the wolf leaps on them and scatters the flock. The hired man runs because he is hired and has no real concern for the sheep. I am the good shepherd and know my own sheep, and they know me. Just as my Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep too in another fold. I must bring them also, and they will heed my voice, and there will be one flock with one shepherd.
Thank you. Jesus, the Good Shepherd, knows my name and your name and calls us by name. There's a lot going on in this passage. Jesus is the shepherd and the gate, and there's thieves and bandits and all kinds of things going on. And I like it that at one point the author of the gospel even says they didn't understand this metaphor about the shepherd, so he tried something else. He stopped talking about the shepherd and he started talking about the gate. But I think at the end of the day, what this passage is about is the fact that Jesus, the Good Shepherd, God, the shepherd of all people, knows our name and calls us by name. And when Jesus calls us, and the reason Jesus is calling us and all people is to lead us to abundant life, to lead us to be the kind of people God has made us to be, and to live the life that God has called us to live, which means we encourage each other to follow Jesus, to follow the Good Shepherd. In a similar way as we can identify the songs of the birds in our backyard, Jesus knows the songs of our hearts, the songs of joy and the cries for help, all of the particular and specific beauty and pain and difficulty of our lives. Jesus knows. And we're learning to recognize the voice of our Good Shepherd. I think that's simply part of the purpose of why we gather century after century as followers of Jesus. We gather to remind each other and to encourage each other to learn the voice of the shepherd and to go in that way that Jesus is leading us. So the passage here in John 10 is about the Good Shepherd. It's not so much, I don't think, about the sheep. And the reason I say that is because when I read this passage, I often want to make it about the sheep, because I understand that when I read this, I'm kind of supposed to think of myself as a sheep somehow who has a shepherd, and I want to ask questions about the sheep, and I want to think through: am I one of the sheep? Am I in the right gate? I'm like a confused traveler in an international airport. Is this my gate? Really? I mean, look at all those strange people lined up. Are we all going to get on that one little plane together? Give me a break. Is this the right gate? Am I in the right place? But it's not about that, this passage. It's not about the sheep. It's about Jesus, the Good Shepherd. Not about a fence that keeps some sheep in and keeps other sheep out, but about the Good Shepherd who is seeking the life of all sheep. Shepherd who leads us to water, to abundant life, to fullness of life. Pastor and author Deb Jones writes an article each week on the gospel reading in a webzine called Journey with Jesus. And this week she wrote in her comments about this story about how Jesus gives his whole life for the sheep. And she says this passage in John 10 is, quote, she says, it's about life that pushes across formidable boundaries, life that flourishes in precarious places, life that never denies the real threat of thieves and bandits and strangers, and yet holds the possibility of pasture, nourishment, protection, and rest. Life that perseveres and maybe even thrives in the valley of the shadow of death. Life that reaches through any opening it can find, however small, however fragile, however tenuous, and insists on generous self-giving. As in, this is my body given for you, take and eat. She goes on to tell a story about a group of Christians who have been gathering on Sunday mornings for nearly 10 years at a place called Friendship Park. And Friendship Park is a plaza that exists along the US-Mexico border wall. And this group of Christians at Friendship Park meets each Sunday morning to share worship and communion. And she says that apparently this border church has survived every obstacle that has come up with the U.S. Border Patrol and shifting relationships there. She writes, if, for example, the Border Patrol won't allow the two sides to stand close enough to the wall to hear each other's voices, they'll stand 50 feet apart and conduct worship over cell phones. If then the participants are forbidden to pass food and drink through the fence, they'll practice sacramental solidarity, which means they'll serve a parallel Eucharist on either side of the border. Some years ago, when the chain link fence gave way to a steel barrier, worshipers continued to pass the peace through the border, pinky to pinky, through tiny holes in the wall. And even these days, under COVID-19 lockdown, the church meets via Zoom and Facebook Live, just the way we do. The Good Shepherd is not creating walls and fences to keep some in and others out. Jesus says, I am the shepherd. I am the gate, not the wall, not a locked secret room with a mysterious password or a key available only to a few. Jesus is the gate. And in verse 10, we heard Jesus say, they will come in and they will go out and find pasture. Those of us who've raised sheep or have seen the way sheep are raised these days, we know that in our culture we tend to drive sheep from behind or use a sheepdog in a large acreage. The sheep don't have any idea where to go. They wander off in the wrong direction. They need to be pushed and prodded. They might eat things that are dangerous to them. They might wander off and get lost. But when the Hebrew Bible and when Jesus talk about shepherds, shepherds in the Middle East then and largely now, rather than driving or herding sheep from behind, would go ahead of their sheep, and the sheep would follow. The sheep aren't fenced into some private acreage to pasture during the day. Instead, the shepherds lead them through deserts, wherever they can find small bits of food, maybe up mountains in search of streams. The shepherd leads them to green pastures where they can eat and lie down. And the shepherd protects them from wild animals, from poachers and bandits. And so at night, shepherds would lie down in a protected area with their sheep, sometimes multiple flocks and multiple shepherds. And some of these shepherds, Jesus refers to this in the passage in John 10. Some are hired hands. They're working for pay for large, probably wealthy farmers who have many sheep. And then there are others who are herding their own small flocks, sheep that belong to them. And Jesus pictures himself as one of these shepherds, not a hired worker just trying to make a living, but caring for his very own beloved sheep, knowing each one by name. And then Jesus pictures himself as the kind of shepherd who lies down in the opening to this little makeshift fence, lies down to sleep in the opening, prepared to guard the sheep from midnight wolves or thieves, ready to put himself at risk, ready even to give his own life for the sheep. And so Jesus talks about thieves who would avoid the gate, who would sneak in under a corner or over a wall, wanting to steal or hurt the sheep. But Jesus is the gate who cares for and protects the sheep. But remember, I said this isn't about the sheep, and I don't think it is. This gate that Jesus pictures himself as is not a gate that that leaves some out and lets others in. This idea of the shepherd in the Hebrew Bible is more like the good shepherd versus the bad shepherd. If you look at Ezekiel 34, the prophet talks about shepherds who would seek their own gain, or leaders who would seek their own gain or profit, rather than leading the people to spiritual water, to spiritual abundance and freedom. And in verse 16, Jesus breaks out of this metaphor a little bit of the shepherd and his one flock, and he gives us a glimpse of his care for all sheep. His work is in the spirit of the great farmer, the good gardener, the great creator who's gathering all sheep. When he says, I have sheep of other flocks that I am gathering, that all may be one flock. That may include some of the wolves too, at some point, if we think back to the prophet Isaiah in Advent, who envisions this time when the wolf and the lamb will even lie down together in peace. Good Shepherd has a broad vision of abundant life. Jesus is our Good Shepherd and protects us even from our own tendencies to harm ourselves and each other. And I think that's just the last thing I want to refer to briefly. I read a book years ago by Philip Keller, who grew up in East Africa and spent several years as a young man working as a shepherd in that culture. And he talks about how part of that work was to protect the sheep from hurting themselves or from hurting each other. He says in spring, he and his young children would spend several days going over the ground and picking out these little white camas flowers. Sheep love to eat these flowers, but they're poisonous to them, and they make them sick or even die. So before they take the sheep to pasture there, they clear out these attractive but poisonous flowers. And then in the summer, when insects would swarm around the sheep and disturb them, and try and nest in their noses so that the sheep would rub their noses against rocks or tree stumps and harm themselves. So at the first sign of the flies, Keller, as a shepherd, would put oil on the sheep's faces and on their heads, and he would repeat this process over and over again throughout the summer to keep the sheep from being disturbed by flies. And then in the mating season, I like this story. The rams would get so intense in their mating rituals and would engage in these epic battles. This is where you see the two rams crashing their heads together and their horns for hours at a time, just banging into each other. And Keller says that he would apply generous quantities of axle grease to the heads of each one of the rams. And then when they collided, the grease would make them glance off each other in such a ridiculous way that they would just stand there feeling stupid. They would slide off each other and go running by. And so they would be protected from killing each other. So maybe we aren't that different from sheep. I know it's not about sheep, but we do need the help of the shepherd to keep us from walking in ways that are harmful to us or to others. That's another reason why we gather as followers of Jesus, why we need each other as followers of Jesus, to remind one another who the shepherd is, and to remind one another of the way of God's love and peace and forgiveness that we have access to, that we're encouraged to walk with each other. We encourage each other to follow this good shepherd. And we can trust the deep love of our shepherd to lead us to life, the way of Jesus, the Christ of God, who shows us the way of wisdom and beauty and reconciliation. The Good Shepherd leads us to fullness of life. We should be clear that following the Good Shepherd does not mean that we're set apart from other human beings, set apart from the realities and hardships of life and the reality of death that we all share. But the Good Shepherd leads us to fullness of life as long as we live, to wholeness in relationships while we are together. The spirit of the Good Shepherd among us leads us to learn together how to love and to care, how to trust God, and to give ourselves with love and courage to one another and to God. And so we give thanks for the Good Shepherd, and I invite you as we close this time to pray with me. Loving God, our shepherd, we give you thanks that you call us by name, that you know all of our voices, you know our cries for help, our songs for joy, you know our playful chirping sounds, you know us when we call out for love and connection, forgiveness, and we trust that you lead us to water, to abundance of life. And we give you thanks. In Jesus' name, amen. Receive these words of blessing. May God bless and keep you. May the face of God shine upon you. May the presence of God embrace you and give you peace. Amen.